If you're an atheist, you've probably read the Bible. If you're a Christian, you've probably read it as well. In fact, most people have read the Bible, or at least parts of it. Even if you haven't, you've definitely heard of that Jesus guy the Christians love so much. One of the most notable things about him are the miracles attributed to him. Each gospel tells of different miracles. The reason for this is to push a specific view of this Jesus character. Every story has its purpose. The more we look at the environment at the time, the more we see exactly what these stories were meant to accomplish. So today, that's exactly what we're doing. To be clear, I won't be going over every miracle story. There are 37 if we include all the miracle stories from all 4 Gospels. This video would just be way too long if we went over them all. But we will go over a few of them and discuss similar myths that were going around long before the Jesus story ever popped up, along with the world that created them. It's long been known that many things in the New Testament are meant to parallel things in the Old. Elijah and Jesus have many of the same miracles, as do Moses and Jesus and Joshua and Jesus. But these are all things we have discussed in previous videos, so I won't be going over them here. Many of the myths in the New Testament are based off ones in the Old, but it is seldom mentioned that many of the myths in the New Testament actually began outside of the Bible. For this video specifically, we'll be talking about the miracles of Jesus and what we can learn about the time they were written. A very good example of this broader Mediterranean context can be found in the works of Josephus. In his Antiquities of the Jews, he tries to justify the miracle of Moses parting the Red Sea by making a comparison to a similar story about Alexander the Great. As for myself, I have delivered every part of this history as I found it in the sacred books, nor let anyone wonder at the strangeness of the narration if a way were discovered to those men of old time, who were free from the wickedness of the modern ages, whether it happened by the will of God or whether it happened of its own accord. While for the sake of those that accompanied Alexander, king of Macedonia, who yet lived, comparatively but a little while ago, the Pamphylian Sea, retired and afforded them a passage through itself, had no other way to go. I mean, when it was the will of God to destroy the monarchy of the Persians, and this is confessed to be true by all that have written about the actions of Alexander. But as to these events, let everyone determine as he pleases. Here we see that Josephus has a strong awareness of the popular legends of his day. But if we look closer, we can see that Josephus shares in the Hellenistic philosophy he grew up around, being that elements are intelligent and recognize those designated by God for world leadership. Josephus understands the Exodus through the Hellenistic lens. Moses and Alexander crossing the sea share a similar theme. The sea recognized its Lord. To gather an understanding of how these stories originated, we must first look at one of the most iconic gods of the era, Asclepius. Asclepius was the son of the god Apollo. His mother was a human named Coronis. His power was so great that he was said to return people from the dead, notably Hippolytus. For resurrecting him, Zeus killed Asclepius. But Zeus, fearing that men might acquire the healing art from him, and so come to the rescue of each other, smote him with a thunderbolt. John 11:1-45 tells a similar story of Jesus raising Lazarus. Asclepius wasn't just known for this, however. There are many myths of his healing, including, but not limited to, curing blindness, curing sickness, curing paralysis of the hands, and curing a mute boy. When it comes to curing blindness, the blind man saw a dream. It seemed to him that the god Asclepius came up to him and with his fingers opened his eyes, and that he first saw the trees in the sanctuary. At daybreak, he walked out sound. Jesus was said to have healed many blind people as well, in Matthew 9:27-31, John 9:1-12, and Luke 18:35-43, to name a few. When it comes to curing mutes, he came as a suppliant to the temple for his voice. When he had performed the preliminary sacrifices and fulfilled the usual rites, thereupon the temple servant who brings in the fire for the god, looking at the boy's father, demanded he should promise to bring within a year the thank offering for the cure if he had obtained that for which he had come. But the boy suddenly said, "I promise." His father was startled at this and asked him to repeat it. The boy repeated the words, and after that became well. Jesus was also known to heal mutes in Luke 11:14-23 and Matthew 9:32-34. But of course, it doesn't end there. Jesus was said to heal paralysis, heal withered hands, and cure the sick. As we saw with Josephus' description of Alexander the Great and Moses, a prominent Hellenistic philosophy was that nature knew those rulers designated by God and bent to their whims. But this right was not just reserved for sons of gods. Similar miracle stories are attributed to rulers in that period. A notable example is Julius Caesar in his efforts to cross the Adriatic Sea. Caesar, in disguise, commands the owner of a boat to take him back across the sea to Brundisium, where troops await. But as they set out, a storm arises, and the owner now pleads that they return. But Caesar was confident that all dangers would make way for him. "Despise the angry sea," he cried to the boat owner, "and spread your sails to the raging wind. If you refuse to make for Italy when heaven forbids, then make for it when I command. One cause alone justifies your fear, that you know not whom you carry. He is a man whom the gods never desert, whom fortune treats scurvily, when she comes merely in answer to his prayer. Burst through the heart of the storm, relying on my protection. Yonder trouble concerns the sky and sea, but not our bark. For Caesar treads on deck, and his fright shall insure her against the waves. Fortune is seeking to confer a boon on me." Although Caesar did have to return to shore, the fact that he was not drowned by the waves was a sign that he was right. The gods would not allow the elements to destroy him. Fortune was in his favor. This is a sign of Caesar's empowerment from heaven. He is convinced that the storm cannot submerge him, since nature knows that he is a designated ruler from heaven. This is precisely the idea portrayed in the story of Jesus stilling the storm, in Mark 4:35-41, Matthew 8:23-27, and Luke 8:22-25. It's clearly shown in Mark by the very last line in the story, Mark 4:41. They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." We have spent a great deal of time talking about some of Jesus' miracles and why they were chosen to represent this Jesus character. Nature bending to his whims shows he's a divine entity. The healing narratives were common at the time and used in many stories to show godliness. As we discussed in our Forged Fiction video on the Gospel of Luke, the story of Jesus raising the widow's son at Nain, Luke 7:11-17, bears a strong resemblance to Elijah raising the son of a Shunammite woman, 2 Kings 17:17-24. For one of the last miracles to discuss, we should take a look at what John calls the first miracle. Jesus miraculously turned water into wine at Cana in John 2:1-12. The story bears resemblance to another narrative of the same type in the Greco-Roman world. At Elis, there is an ancient theater between the Agora and the Menaios, and also a shrine of Dionysus. The statue of Dionysus is a work of Praxiteles. Of all the gods, the Eleans especially worship Dionysus, and they say that the god consistently visits them at the annual festival at Theon. Outside the city by 8 stadia is the place where they hold the festival, called the Thia. On the evening before, the priests carry 3 kettles into the sanctuary and set them down empty, while both citizens of the town and even strangers are present, as many as happen to be there. Both the citizen and the priest, and whomever may wish to do so, put seals on the doors of the sanctuary. In the morning, they come to read the signs for themselves, and when they go into the building, they find the kettles filled with wine. These things the most trustworthy men of Elis, and even strangers, swear it to be just as I have described. The Andrians also say that every other year at the feast of Dionysus, wine flows of its own accord from the temple. These kind of miracle stories were actually used by local cult sanctuaries to attract pilgrims to their annual festivals. The Jesus story, similar to this one, was used to attract tourists. The final miracle we will look over is the miraculous feeding of 5,000. This is a special miracle because it is the only one that appears in all 4 Gospels. Its placement in the narrative is actually way too similar to the placement in Mark's narrative to be a coincidence, especially because the other Gospels place it differently. But we discussed that more in depth in our Forged Fiction video on the Gospel of John, so we won't get into it here. But the narrative resembles a story of another Old Testament prophet, Elisha. In 2 Kings 4:42-44, Elisha feeds 100 men with 20 loaves of bread and some fresh ears of grain. But it is seldom noticed that 2 Kings 4:38-41 is another miracle story. When there was a famine in the land, Elisha told his servant to make some stew for the sons of the prophets at Gilgal. After a lapful of wild gourds were cut up into the pot of stew, the men eating it exclaimed, "O man of God, there is death in the pot." When Elisha then commanded that some flour be thrown into the pot, he told his servant, "Serve the people and let them eat." The miracle concludes by stating, "And there was nothing harmful any longer in the pot." Elisha's command to his servant, "Serve the people and let them eat," is basically repeated in the next feeding episode, "Give it to the people and let them eat." This shows how interconnected the two narratives are. Both commands of Elisha, especially the latter, stand behind Jesus' command to the disciples in Mark 6:37, "You give them something to eat." It should be clear that the feeding of 5,000 in Mark 6:30-44 was written by a Palestinian Jewish Christian to convince his fellow Jewish Christians and Jews that Jesus was greater than the greatest Jewish miracle worker of early Judaism. Your prophet can feed 100 people with 20 loaves? Huh, well mine can feed 5,000 with just 5. Similarities cannot be dismissed just because there are differences. West Side Story and Romeo and Juliet take place in two very different periods of time with different characters, but West Side Story is a direct retelling of Romeo and Juliet. To suggest it's not would be ridiculous. The miracles of Jesus were written the way they were to push a certain narrative. There was a reason these miracle stories were told over other miracles. The authors had an agenda to push. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe, and if you really love us, consider supporting us on Patreon. We'll see you next time.